I'm Esther Whitlow, 69 years old, and when my son called to invite me to dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town, I hadn't heard from him in months. The cold had just begun to settle over our little corner of Nebraska, and I'd been stacking firewood on the porch when the phone rang. Miles said he and Trina wanted to treat me just the three of us. He even offered to pick me up himself, which was unlike him. Miles was never one for sentiment, and Trina never made time unless it involved planning something for show. But when I stepped into his car that evening and he smiled like it was good to see me, I let myself believe something had changed, and that was my first mistake before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt someone pull you close just to push you away. I've lived my whole life in Larkridge, a place where people wave even when they don't know your name, and winters arrive with the kind of wind that makes you tuck a quilt around your knees, even in the daylight. My late husband, Jack, was the school principal for nearly 3 decades, and I ran workshops at the community center, sewing budgeting mentoring girls whose mamas worked double shifts at the feed store or cleaned the motel rooms out by the highway. We didn't have much, but our home sat on the edge of Long Pine Lake, a stretch of quiet water passed down from Jack's grandfather. We raised our son, Miles, in that house, taught him to skim stones off the dock and shake a man's hand like he meant it. And every fall, we raked leaves into the biggest piles you've ever seen. But somewhere along the way, Miles learned different values. He went off to college out east, married Trina, whose family threw banquets instead of backyard barbecues, and started working in something that sounded important but never made much sense to me. They bought a home in the suburbs and only visited on holidays, and even then, Trina kept checking her phone, and Miles seemed more interested in adjusting the thermostat than asking how I was really doing. I told myself they were busy and young and building a life, but lately the quiet had grown too thick in the house. The quilt Jack and I picked out for our anniversary still rested on the foot of the bed, but now I pulled it up every night just for company. So when Miles called out of nowhere and offered to pick me up himself for a special dinner, something in me softened. Maybe it was the hope that never quite leaves a mother's heart, or maybe I just missed being seen. Trina wore one of those wrap jackets she always favored, sleek and beige like the catalog pages she probably clipped her life from. She smiled when she saw me, said she liked my scarf, even helped me out of my coat. We stepped into the restaurant, and the amber light was so warm it made my glasses fog up. Linen napkins, real silver. A waiter in a pressed vest who called me ma'am as he poured wine. I hadn't been anywhere like that in years. Miles filled my glass, though he knew I preferred water. Said it was a celebration. Wouldn't say what for. Just smiled and nodded to the menu while Trina leaned in, asked how I'd been sleeping lately. Said it with that soft tilt in her voice like she was fluffing a pillow, not planting a question. I told her the nights were quiet. She nodded. Like that meant something to her, and went back to her soup. They asked about the lake, asked if I'd been down to the cabin lately, mentioned how beautiful it looked in autumn and how it might be perfect for small gatherings, weddings, retreats. Trina's words were casual, but too smooth, like a ribbon tied too tightly. By the time the dessert came, I saw it. A folder from Miles's coat, thick, neat too. Neat. He slid it across the table with a smile that never touched his eyes. Said they'd been talking to professionals. Nothing serious, just ideas. If I signed now, they could get a head start before winter. The air above the table was golden, but I felt cold inside. I looked down and saw my name already typed in bold, right there above a blank line. And that's when I knew I hadn't been invited to dinner. I'd been summoned. Miles didn't say a word as he drove me home. The headlights carved through fog that had settled low along the road. Trina stared out the window, her phone glowing in her lap. The car was too warm, the kind of artificial heat that makes your skin itch. When we pulled into the drive, Miles asked if I'd think about it. I nodded without meaning it. He kissed my cheek. Trina never got out of the car. Inside, I set the folder on the kitchen table and stood there with my hands still on my purse straps. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and last week's cornbread. The heater hummed softly in the background, but the air felt cold. I didn't open the folder. I just stared at it like it might disappear if I waited long enough. Past the window, the lake shimmered between the trees, nearly hidden in the dark. That land had belonged to my family for 3 generations. Jack always said it carried more memory than dirt. I barely slept. When the sun finally crept through the curtains, I sat on the edge of the bed in my slippers, hands resting on my knees. The house felt still, but not peaceful. Even the birds outside seemed unsure whether to sing. I made a pot of coffee and a slice of toast, but nothing tasted right. My hands shook a little as I stirred in sugar, the spoon tapping softly against the ceramic. I couldn't stop replaying that moment, the way Miles slid the folder across the table like he was handing me a menu. Trina's fingers resting on the pen before I'd even spoken. I tried to tell myself they meant well, that maybe it was just poor timing or clumsy delivery. But the more I thought about it, the less I believed it. That dinner wasn't about connection. It was a transaction, and I was the asset. By noon, I stepped outside and walked toward the lake. The wind was sharp, pulling at the hem of my sweater. The trees had turned bare nearly overnight, their limbs stretching toward the sky like questions. Down by the water, the bench Jack built stood solid even after all these years. He used to sit there with a thermos and a book, humming those old folk tunes that didn't have lyrics, just sounds. I sat down and let the quiet press in. That place had always been where I went to feel steady again. Jack had been so clear about what the land meant. He didn't want it turned into condos or lodges or rented out for strangers to sip champagne beside someone else's memories. He used to say, "Let it stay real. Let it stay ours." And I believed him. I thought Miles did too. When I got back to the house, I passed the hallway where we kept the family photos. My eye caught the empty space right away. There used to be a picture there one Miles took years ago of me holding a basket of wildflowers near the dock. It was gone. I checked the drawer where we kept spare frames, even the coat closet. Nothing, just the clean square of wall where it used to be. That night, I made soup, but left it on the stove too long. I sat by the window wrapped in a throw blanket, watching the reflection of the moon dance across the lake. 2 days later, I drove to their house. I hadn't called ahead. I brought a small box of tins Miles used to love as a boy. I figured I'd drop them off, maybe leave them on the porch if no one answered. The wreath on their door was tidy and red, but the kind you buy in bulk, no scent, no soul. Trina opened the door. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stepped aside, just enough for me to enter. I stood in the foyer for a moment, adjusting to the brighter light. Their house smelled like lemon polish and something baked, but there was no warmth in it. On the wall just past the entryway was a new collage, framed prints in perfect alignment. Family trips, backyard dinners, birthday candles, smiling faces. Miles and Trina in every frame, their kids in the middle. Not one photo of me. I moved closer, searching, scanning. I wasn't there, not once. I stood still, hand hovering just above the glass. Trina came up behind me, said they'd just had them printed a surprise for the holidays. Her voice was calm, almost cheerful, like it hadn't occurred to her what that wall meant. Or maybe it had. I turned and placed the box of tins on the entry table. "Miles wasn't home," she said. I didn't ask where he was. I didn't want another excuse that would turn sour in my chest by evening. By the fireplace, a small pile of gifts waited to be wrapped. One box had a tag, "To Grandma." The handwriting was uneven. A child's. A card on top said, "Miss you" in crayon. I swallowed hard and looked away. Outside, the wind had picked up. I pulled my coat tighter as I walked to the car. On the way home, I passed the sign in front of the church advertising their Thanksgiving potluck. I hadn't been invited. Not by Miles, not by anyone else. Usually I brought the stuffing or baked the pies. This year, no one asked. Back at the house, I sat on the porch with my gloves still on, staring out at the lake. I couldn't stop seeing that photo wall, the way it looked like I'd never existed, like I'd been cleaned out of their memories on purpose. Later, I took the old photo album down from the shelf, the real one, with the soft leather cover and torn corners. I flipped through the pages until I found the picture. Me and Miles on the dock. He must have been 8. His cheeks were sunburned, and his hands were full of frog, his eyes wide with joy. I took it out of the sleeve, found a little wooden frame, and set it by the front window, where the light came in best. The next morning, I heard Trina's voice before I saw her. I had just come inside from sweeping the porch when it drifted in through the kitchen window, sharp-clipped, too confident. She was walking along the gravel path behind my neighbor's hedge, talking into her phone. She didn't think I was home, or she didn't care. She was talking about permits and branding, something called the Brenner Retreat at Long Pine Lake. She spoke like it was already happening. I froze. She mentioned the last piece they needed Esther's land. Once that was signed over, they could begin. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. That dinner, the photos, even the gift from the children, it was all part of a plan. And I wasn't part of it. I was just the key to unlock what they already believed was theirs. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after hearing Trina's voice outside the window. The mug of tea I'd poured had gone cold in my hands. The house didn't feel like mine that morning. The walls were still lined with framed school photos and lake scenes, but the air felt thinner, like something had been taken and not returned. I folded the quilt at the end of the bed and placed it across the armchair, in the corner, the same one Jack used to sit in to read the paper. Later that afternoon, I pulled out the file box from the linen closet. It was heavier than I remembered. The lid stuck for a moment before giving way with a soft pop. Inside were manila folders stacked neatly, grant applications, receipts from the old workshop's rosters of women's circles from decades ago. My handwriting was there on most of it. Jack's too, in smaller print, always pressed a little harder with the pen. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was the deed. It had Jack's signature and mine beside it. He had written one sentence above his name, "Let it stay hers. Let it serve." I carried the box to the kitchen and cleared a spot on the table. For hours, I sorted through paper, wiping dust from pages, reading notes from girls who had come to the retreat, some who just needed a quiet place for a while. I found one from a young woman named Claire. She had written that being near the lake was the first time she ever felt safe in her own skin. I sat back and let the words settle. That land wasn't just trees and water. It had been a haven. By evening, I lit a candle by the window. Not for mood, not for prayer, just so the room didn't feel quite so empty. Outside, the lake was still, with only a ripple or two cutting across the reflection of the sky. I stood for a while, looking out at it, remembering the summer Jack built the dock, with help from Miles, who was 12 at the time and still eager to help without being asked. That version of him had felt so far away lately. I wondered if it had been a slow change, or if I'd missed the moment it shifted. The next morning, I called the only person I could think of who might still remember all this the way Jack had Harold Tilson. He'd helped Jack write the will and had since retired to a quieter place upstate. His voice on the phone was just as I remembered, steady, a little dry, but always kind. I told him about the dinner, about the papers Miles had brought about Trina's plans, and the retreat name she spoke so easily into that phone. There was a pause, and then he said, "Let's walk through this." Harold asked careful questions. He took notes, checked old records while we talked. He said the deed was solid. My name held full custodial rights, and unless I chose to sign it over, nothing could be done. But he also mentioned something stronger, a community trust. It would protect the land beyond me, ensure that it couldn't be sold or repurposed for profit. I could write into it a purpose that matched Jack's original vision. Harold said if I wanted to move forward, he'd help set it up. And then right before we hung up, he said, "Esther, don't forget your name means something in that town." After I put down the phone, I didn't move for a while. I sat at the kitchen table with the file box still open, the soft scent of old ink and cedar rising faintly from its contents. I thought about that my name meaning something. It hadn't crossed my mind in years. I had grown so used to shrinking to letting others decide what mattered. But something had started to shift. I called the community center and left a message for Diane, the director. Then I reached out to Loretta and Mara, two women who had spent years teaching alongside me. We'd once run summer cooking classes, writing workshops, and weekly lunches for women whose children had long moved away. All of us had slowed down, retired, or semi-retired, but I knew they'd remember the feeling of what we'd built. I asked if they'd come by for tea. I didn't explain everything, just said I had something on my mind. That night, I sat at the desk by the window and began drafting a mission statement. I called it the Light on the Lake Foundation, a place for women over 50 to come together to learn to rest, to be seen. I listed out seasonal retreats, skill-building classes, support circles, even garden workshops. I didn't know yet how it would all work, but I knew what I wanted it to feel like. The next morning, the house felt lighter. Not because anything had changed outside, but because I had stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission. I made a grocery list. I swept the porch. I wiped down the kitchen counters. And then I went to the closet and pulled out the same cardigan I used to wear when I led sewing circles. It still fit a little looser around the sleeves. Just before lunch, the phone rang again. It was Loretta. She said she'd bring cinnamon rolls. Mara offered to come early to help me set up. Diane called an hour later. She said, "Whatever this is, I'm in." I smiled and looked out at the lake. The water was still again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like it was waiting. I still hadn't opened the folder Miles gave me. It remained on the table untouched, just as it had been the night they brought it. But the papers didn't scare me anymore, because now I had my own. The morning light came in pale through the kitchen window, soft enough that it didn't wake me all the way. I stood there in my robe, one hand on the kettle, the other resting on the corner of the table where I'd left the file. The papers I pulled from the linen closet were stacked neatly beside it. Now deeds, tax records, photos from past retreats. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dried lavender, the way linen closets always did in homes like mine. I sipped my tea and stared at the folded napkin where I'd started drafting a mission for the foundation. The edges had curled overnight. By late morning, Diane came through the side door carrying a basket of notepads and highlighters. She set them down beside the stove and said she'd brought extras in case we wanted to sketch out a calendar. Loretta and Mara arrived not long after, both in winter coats dusted with frost. Loretta carried a tin of oatmeal raisin cookies. Mara brought a notebook that still had stickers from her grandkids on the cover. I laid out mugs and the chipped teapot Jack and I used for company. It didn't take much to make the room feel ready. We sat around the kitchen table like we had years ago when we used to plan the summer programs. Diane flipped through her notepad eyes, scanning old budget numbers. Mara leaned over the table, talking through transportation options for women who might not drive anymore. Loretta made a list of potential workshop ideas, journaling simple cooking, grief support, financial independence. I added a note beside that last one, legal basics, and underlined it twice. The conversation moved steadily, not rushed, not overly excited. just purposeful. The kind of focus women our age tend to carry when something matters. By noon, the table was covered in notes and half-drunk mugs of peppermint tea. Outside the lake was still the ice just beginning to skim along the edges. Every now and then, the wind pushed against the windows, but we kept working. After they left, I stood in the doorway for a long while looking out across the porch. My hands were still warm from the teacup. The papers they'd brought sat on the kitchen counter. Notes, names, timelines. Real things. Tangible. I reached into the envelope Harold had sent and pulled out the initial draft of the trust agreement. The foundation would own the land. The board would govern its use. Every program would stay rooted in the community, and no sale or development could take place without unanimous approval from the board. My name was no longer the only one that mattered. That thought didn't scare me. It steadied me. The following afternoon, I received a call from Harold. His voice was clear, direct. He said everything was in motion. We just needed to finalize the bylaws and register the foundation formally. I thanked him and hung up, then called Diane to confirm the board list. She suggested we include Bernice from the Historical Society. I agreed, made a note, and went to look through my old address book. The one with cracked leather binding and names I hadn't called in years. That night, I pulled out the photo album again. Not out of sadness this time, just to look. I turned the pages, slowly stopping now and then on a note or a corner where Jack had tucked a receipt or ticket stub. I found the picture of me and Miles on the dock, the one I'd reframed and placed near the window. I studied his face, the freckles on his nose, the way his hair stuck up in the back. That boy had once run through this house with a towel around his shoulders, pretending to be a superhero. Now, he sat in boardrooms with people like Trina, planning spa retreats with other people's money. The next morning was bright and sharp. I stepped out onto the porch and saw a light layer of frost on the railing. I walked down to the mailbox, my boots crunching over the gravel. Inside were 2 flyers and the local newspaper. Folded between the pages was a letter from the town office. A zoning update notice. They were reviewing shoreline property classifications, including ours. I read it twice. Then went inside and added another bullet point to our next board meeting municipal updates zoning watch. The wind picked up that afternoon. I could hear it pushing through the trees along the lake. I made a pot of lentil soup and set out 3 bowls even though I was eating alone. Old habit. I sat at the table and read through the final version of the foundation charter. There in clean type was the name we'd chosen light on the Lake Foundation. Right beneath it, established to protect, preserve, and empower. Jack would have liked that. I signed my name at the bottom and sealed the envelope for Harold. That evening, I lit another candle just like the first one. This time, by the fireplace. No words, no ceremony. Just a quiet moment to mark what had changed. The land was no longer a question. It was an answer. The folder Miles gave me still sat unopened by the window. I hadn't moved it. I didn't need to. The foundation was real now. It had a name, a mission, and a voice. So did I. It was a Thursday afternoon when I saw their car pull up the gravel drive. I recognized the sound of tires over frost before I ever looked out the window. I stood at the sink, wiping my hands on a dish towel, watching the red sedan ease to a stop by the front porch. Trina got out first coat, buttoned up to her chin, a leather binder pressed tight against her side. Miles followed behind her, with his hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, like a boy waiting to be scolded. They didn't knock. I had left the door unlocked, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe part of me expected them. Maybe part of me had been expecting this since the night of that dinner. I stayed in my usual chair near the window as they entered, letting the late afternoon sun stretch across the floor. The house smelled faintly of lentils and pine cleaner. I hadn't put away the second pot of tea yet. Trina started in, quickly flipping open her binder and laying a stack of pages on the coffee table. She spoke like she'd rehearsed it. There were projections maps, funding breakdowns, investor quotes. Her voice was steady and pleasant, almost detached. She never said the word home. She never used the word family. It was all property potential, retreat capacity, brand development. Miles sat quietly beside her, nodding at intervals, but his eyes stayed on the floor most of the time. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer tea. I just let them talk. Trina reached the final page and turned it toward me. There, in bold font, were my initials, typed next to a signature line labeled Property Owner Approval. She looked up and smiled, as if this were just another step in a process already underway. I didn't lean forward. I didn't touch the papers. I reached beside my chair, opened a manila envelope, and took out a single sheet of paper. I slid it across the table slowly. "This is from my attorney," I said. "It confirms that the lake property now belongs to the Light on the Lake Foundation. I'm no longer the sole owner. The foundation does not intend to sell." Trina blinked. Her hands went still on the binder. Miles sat up straighter, brows knitting. But why, he asked. His voice was quiet, almost unsure. "Why didn't you talk to us first?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I did. That night at the restaurant, I listened. And you both made it clear what you wanted. This land was never meant to be flipped or rented or turned into a boutique anything. It was meant to be shared with dignity. That's what I'm doing." Trina's cheeks flushed, though her expression didn't shift. She closed her binder and stood first. Miles hesitated, looking as if he might say something else, but he didn't. He followed her out. They didn't say goodbye. I stayed seated until I heard the car pull back onto the road. Then I gathered the pages Trina had left behind, her charts, her diagrams, her neat columns of numbers, and walked them to the fireplace. I didn't rush. I just set the stack inside and struck a match. The flames took quickly, curling the edges inward until nothing was left but blackened ash. The house grew quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that feels like something missing. The kind that settles in when something has been set right. That evening, I lit the porch light and left it on later than usual. Not because I was expecting anyone, but because I liked the way it looked against the siding. A soft, golden glow in the cold. I made a pot of chamomile tea and stood by the window watching the lake. There was no movement, just the steady stillness of winter pressing down on the shoreline. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write about what had happened. I folded the letter from Harold back into its envelope and tucked it into the file box with the rest of the foundation documents. The folder Miles had once given me still sat unopened on the side table. I let it stay there. It didn't hold anything I needed anymore. Later that night, I walked through the hallway and paused where the family photos hung. The one of me and Miles on the dock still sat near the front window, just where I'd placed it. I looked at it for a moment, then adjusted the frame slightly so the light would catch it better in the morning. The house didn't feel big or empty. It felt full in a quiet way. I hadn't won a fight. I'd just made a choice, and that choice was finally mine. The morning of the foundation launch came with a low fog that sat just above the lake. I stepped out onto the porch with my cup of black coffee, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were standing inside a held breath. From where I stood, I could just make out the folding chairs we'd arranged beneath the sycamore tree, a small wooden platform facing the water. We hadn't planned anything elaborate. No signs, no decorations, no microphones. Just a table with paper cups, a few thermoses of cider, and a pot of soup warming inside. Diane had picked up rolls from the bakery. Mara brought a stack of handmade journals tied with ribbon. Loretta showed up with a carload of folding chairs and a clipboard full of phone numbers and mailing lists. By 10 o'clock, people started arriving. Some I hadn't seen in years. Women I'd taught sewing to in the back room of the community center, neighbors who used to walk the lake trail when Jack was still alive. Even one of the librarians from the reading circle we held for older adults. A few came quietly, hands tucked into their coats, unsure if they were guests or participants. I greeted each one the same way, with both hands and their name if I remembered it, and if I didn't, with a welcome that felt like I did. We began just after everyone had arrived. I stepped up to the little platform, the wood still damp from the morning air, and looked out over the small group. There were maybe 30 people, maybe a few more. I could see scarves, knit hats, gray roots tucked beneath hoods. Women who had spent years doing for others, holding families together, slipping into the background. They looked at me without expectation, just patience. I cleared my throat, hands folded lightly in front of me. I suppose you're all wondering why I'm standing here instead of sitting quietly at home. That got a few chuckles, low and warm. The truth is, I spent a long time waiting for the people closest to me to understand what mattered. And eventually, I stopped waiting. I paused, letting the silence settle around us. The lake behind me was still as glass. This land wasn't meant to be a business deal. It wasn't meant to be a transaction. It was always meant to be a place where something good could grow. So today, we begin the Light on the Lake Foundation. Our first focus will be supporting women in their later years, training, housing help, whatever gives us back some control in a world that often forgets we're still here. There were nods across the crowd. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a gloved hand. Another reached over and held her friend's elbow. I looked at them and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time, recognition not just of who I was, but of what we shared. I'm not handing this land over to someone else's legacy, I said. I'm keeping it with those of us who still believe in second chances, no matter how old we are. Applause followed, not loud, but deep. It moved through the group like warmth passed hand to hand. Afterward, we gathered near the fire pit and passed around cups of cider. Loretta handed out the journals, saying they were for anything, a list, a recipe, a dream someone hadn't had room for in a while. We sat in clusters, swapping old stories, remembering names that hadn't been spoken in years. The lake stayed quiet, watching. I didn't think about Miles. I didn't wonder if Trina would show up. Their absence didn't weigh anything. Because that morning wasn't about who wasn't there. It was about who chose to be. When the crowd had gone and only a few of us remained to fold the chairs, I stood again by the water. The ground was soft from the week's rain, and the trees lining the shore looked as if they were listening. I let my hand rest on the back of the bench Jack had built and felt something settle in my chest. Not relief, not pride, just stillness. The next morning, Marlene left the town paper on the porch like she always did. I didn't expect anything new, usually just school board news or recipes clipped from the county fair. But there, right below the fold, was Trina's name. I carried the paper inside, set it on the counter, and opened it slowly. The headline was blunt: Brenner's lakefront project collapses following funding loss and community pushback. Beneath it was a photo of Trina at a chamber meeting, arms folded, smile careful. In black and white, she looked smaller. The article mentioned missed deadlines, withdrawn investors, and public complaints. One quote stood out. It never felt like it was meant for us. I folded the paper and returned it to the bench outside. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything that needed to be named. Just the quiet understanding that sometimes the choices we make matter more than anyone will ever know. Later that afternoon, I walked back down to the lake. The wind carried the scent of pine, and somewhere beneath it, something faintly sweet. Maybe the last leaves, Maybe the earth remembering spring. I sat on the bench for a while, coat zipped high, gloves folded in my lap. The water lapped against the shore, steady and slow. I didn't know if Miles would ever call again. I didn't know if Trina would ever speak my name. But the house behind me stood firm. The foundation papers sat safe in their drawer, and the lake, as always, stayed right where it was. It was quiet that week after the article came out. I went about my days without hurry, folding laundry, steeping tea, pruning back the frost-burned herbs outside the kitchen window. The lake held its silence, a mirror of the stillness I felt inside. No word from Miles. Nothing from Trina. The phone stayed silent. The mailbox held nothing but catalogs and coupons. I didn't expect anything. I had stopped expecting anything a long time ago. On Thursday morning, I opened the old sewing box Jack gave me on our 25th anniversary. The inside was lined with faded red velvet, and the compartments still held buttons and needles from years gone by. I lifted the false bottom and pulled out the envelope I'd tucked there weeks earlier. It was his last handwritten note, the one he left in the final months before he passed. I had read it before, but that morning I unfolded it again, smoothing the creases with my thumbs. You built this house, Esther. You grew the garden, taught the classes, opened your hands to everyone. If the day comes when someone tries to take what you've made, protect it. It belongs to your spirit. I sat for a while at the kitchen table, the paper resting flat in front of me. Then I lit a small candle in the window, the same kind I lit the day the foundation launched. There was no need for fanfare. It was just a way to mark that I had not forgotten what mattered. Later that afternoon, Diane, Loretta, and Mara came by. The wind was sharp that day, and they came bundled in scarves and heavy coats, cheeks pink from the cold. I had put the kettle on early, and the scent of chamomile drifted through the house as they stepped inside. We gathered around the table again, but this time there was something different in the air. We were no longer planning. We were building. We sketched out the first seasonal retreat, a spring weekend, with writing circles, shared meals, and long walks along the lake path. Loretta offered to lead a budgeting class. Mara said she could host a grief group for women navigating life after caregiving. Diane volunteered to reach out to the community college about printing flyers. I jotted down every detail on the whiteboard, careful and steady, like tracing a map back to something we'd forgotten we could reach. By early evening, we had a full agenda and a fresh pot of tea. The house glowed from within the way it used to when Jack was alive, and Miles still came home with a backpack flung over one shoulder. The women lingered after we finished, not quite ready to leave. We stood by the window, watching the streetlights blink on. No one said it out loud, but we all felt it, the sense that we had reclaimed something that never should have been questioned. After they left, I took a walk down to the lake. The moon had risen early, hanging low and clear. The ground crunched beneath my boots. I sat on the bench and listened to the water moving gently against the dock. It wasn't the same sound as summer, but it held the same rhythm. Back inside, I picked up a mirror from the drawer beside my reading chair. It was a simple thing, wooden frame, slightly worn, but I hadn't looked in it for a while. I placed it on the tea table next to my chair, catching the last of the evening light. I didn't look to check my reflection. I looked to meet it. There were more lines around my mouth than I remembered, and my hair had softened into silver, especially near the temples. But my eyes were steady. My lips were pressed together, not in anger, not in sorrow, just sure. Each morning after that, I made it a habit. Tea in hand, candle-lit mirror angled toward the light. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer answers. I just showed up for myself, quiet and full. Some days, the house held laughter again. Women came by with stories and questions and tins of cookies wrapped in wax paper. We started a binder for ideas. We kept minutes at our meetings. We added new names to the board, women who had once been background figures but now had room to speak. Miles never called. Trina stopped showing up at local events. Her name drifted from conversation to silence. Once at the post office, I heard someone whisper something about the failed project, but I didn't lean in. I just stepped out into the cold with my letters tucked beneath my arm. That wasn't my story anymore. I had found something steadier than recognition, something stronger than permission. And I had found it not in applause or headlines, but in the slow return to a voice I had almost forgotten belonged to me. The days found a gentle rhythm after that first season. I woke early and let the house fill with the soft hush of a new morning, the kettle singing quietly while I watched the light move across the kitchen floor. The lake outside was never exactly the same, sometimes wrapped in mist, sometimes shining hard and blue, sometimes hidden beneath a drift of snow, but always there, solid as the faith that had carried me through each turn. The foundation kept me busy, but never in the way that left me tired. I met women I might never have crossed paths with before. Some came for advice, others for a kind word, all of them bringing stories that wove their way into mine. I spent time teaching small workshops in the living room, helping women learn how to read a contract, write a letter to the county, or stand up for what belonged to them. Some days, the kitchen table was scattered with notes and laughter. Other evenings, I walked the path to the water with one or two of the women, sharing the kind of silence that only comes with trust. Miles never called. Trina's absence became part of the landscape, no longer a question or an ache, simply a fact that sat quietly in the background. The space they left was slowly filled by new faces, new friendships, and a growing sense of belonging that didn't depend on blood or history. I kept the little mirror on the tea table. Every morning after the chores were done and the house was quiet again, I would sit in my chair, cup of lemon tea in hand, and look into it for just a moment. I didn't see a woman erased from her family or a widow left behind. I saw someone who had held her ground even when the world tried to nudge her out of the frame. I saw strength not because I won every battle, but because I kept showing up, even when it would have been easier to give up. As the seasons turned and the foundation grew, the land felt lighter, as if it too had been waiting for its real purpose to be restored. Women gathered beneath the sycamore tree, their voices rising in laughter or song, sometimes in quiet reflection. It never mattered how many came or who missed a meeting. What mattered was that the door stayed open and there was always a place for someone who needed it. I learned something in those months I wish I'd understood sooner, that peace isn't found in what others give you or the recognition you receive. It grows out of the choices you make to honor your own story, to protect what matters, to let go when holding on hurts more than helps. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come and started building the kind of life that felt right in my own skin. If you're listening and you've ever felt overlooked or pushed aside, I hope you know it's never too late to choose yourself. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It's a quiet decision made each morning to live with dignity and courage, no matter who sees you. Thank you for walking this road with me. If my story meant something to you, I hope you'll share your own, or simply hold it close. We all deserve to be seen, and sometimes the first step is seeing ourselves.